In the small, busy town of Ayetoro, everyone knew Bola. She was the best midwife in the area. Her hands were gentle, her voice was soft, and she always brought smiles to mothers' faces when they held their babies for the first time. But after Bola gave birth to her second child, something changed. Bola's first child, Tenny, was 4 years old and full of energy. Her second child, a baby girl named Faikemi, was tiny and cried a lot. Bola should have been happy, but she wasn't. Inside her heart, there was no joy, only sadness. She felt tired all the time, even though she was not sick. Bola's husband, Ayetoro, was a busy man. He worked long hours and didn't notice that Bola was struggling. Bola cooked, cleaned, took care of the children, and still tried to help other mothers in the community. She wanted everyone to think she was fine, but she wasn't. One day, Bola's mother-in-law, Mama Kunal, came to visit. Mama Kunal looked at Bola and shook her head. "Why is this house so messy?" "You are just being lazy, Bola," she said. "Women these days have no strength." Bola wanted to cry, but she kept quiet. She didn't know how to explain that her heart felt like it was breaking every day. As days passed, Bola started losing her smile. Sometimes, she even forgets to change Faikemi's diaper. Her friends noticed, but they didn't say anything. "Bola is strong," they told each other. "She will be fine." But Bola was not fine. At first, it was small things. She forgot to comb her hair or put on her slippers before going outside. Then, bigger things happened. One day, she burned the soup she was cooking for Ayetoro and Tenny because she had fallen asleep on the kitchen floor. Tenny came to her, pulling on her wrapper. "Mama, the food is smelling." But Bola just stared at the pot, too tired to care. Her friends, who once stopped by to chat and admire Faikemi, noticed the empty look in her eyes. "Bola, you need to rest," said Saad, her closest friend. But Bola shook her head. "There is no time to rest. Who will take care of everything if I do?" The truth was, Bola felt like a failure. She had helped so many mothers bring life into the world, yet here she was, unable to care for her own child. At night, while Faikemi cried and Tenny tossed in her sleep, Bola lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her chest felt heavy, like there was a stone pressing on it, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't breathe deeply. Mama Kunal's words rang in her ears. Lazy, she had called Bola. Every time Bola thought of asking for help, the shame stopped her. She feared people would think she was weak or unfit to be a mother. So, she carried the burden alone. Ayetoro was too busy to notice the little signs. When he came home late at night, tired from work, Bola forced herself to smile and set his food on the table. "Thank you, my dear," he would say, barely looking up before heading to bed. He didn't see the dark circles under her eyes or the way her hands shook as she washed the dishes. The house grew quieter with each passing day. Faikemi, who once cried loudly, now whimpered softly, almost as if she knew her mother couldn't handle too much noise. Tenny, a lively child who loved to dance and sing, started spending more time outside with neighbors because Bola no longer had the energy to play with him. One evening, Bola sat in the corner of the living room, holding Faikemi. She watched as Tenny tried to tie a piece of cloth around his waist, pretending to be one of the dancers he had seen at the village festival. "Mama, look at me," he called out, spinning in circles. Bola looked at him but didn't respond. Her mind was far away, trapped in a fog she couldn't escape. Tenny stopped spinning and stared at his mother. "Mama, are you sad?" he asked in a small voice. Bola's throat tightened, but she forced a weak smile. "No, my son. I'm just tired." Tenny nodded, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. As the days passed, the weight in Bola's heart grew heavier. She found herself walking to the riverside more often, a place where she could sit alone and think. The calm water seemed to call to her, offering peace she couldn't find anywhere else. She would sit on the rocks, Faikemi in her arms, and watch the river flow. Sometimes, she whispered to the water, "Why can't I be happy?" The riverside became Bola's escape. There, Away from the watchful eyes of the community, she could let her tears fall freely. Faikimi, too young to understand her mother's pain, would gaze up at her with wide, innocent eyes. Bola would stroke the baby's soft cheek and feel a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took her breath away. "I love you, my child," she would say softly. But the love was wrapped in fear that she wasn't good enough, fear that she couldn't give Faikimi the care she deserved. Each visit to the river felt like stepping into another world. The soothing sound of the flowing water seemed to drown out the chaos in Bola's mind. But as comforting as it was, the river also reminded her of her own fragility. She felt like the small leaves that floated on its surface, tossed around, directionless, and at the mercy of forces she couldn't control. One afternoon, as she sat on the smooth rocks by the riverside, Faikimi began to cry. Bola tried rocking her, humming a soft tune, but the baby's cries grew louder. Bola felt her chest tighten. The sound was overwhelming, like it was echoing inside her head. "Please, Faikimi," she whispered, her voice trembling, "just stop crying." But Faikimi didn't stop. Bola's hands began to shake. The tears she had been holding back spilled over, and she clutched her baby tightly to her chest. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I don't know what to do." "I'm so sorry." As she cried, the guilt deepened. She thought about the mothers she had helped during her years as a midwife. They had all looked up to her, trusting her to guide them through the hardest moments of their lives. How could she, Bola, who had been their source of strength, feel so weak now? That evening, she returned home with Faikimi, her heart heavier than ever. The house was quiet as usual. Alakunal was working late, and Tenny was playing at the neighbor's house. Bola sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. Faikimi had finally fallen asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Bola watched her, torn between love and despair. She thought about telling Alakunal how she felt, but the words seemed impossible to form. "He's too busy," she told herself. "He won't understand." She thought about her mother-in-law, but the memory of being called lazy made her chest ache. Even her friends, who had always been there for her before, now seemed like strangers. She didn't want them to see her like this. The next morning, Mama Kunnel came for another unannounced visit. She walked into the house, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Bola, why is this place always in a mess these days?" she asked, frowning. "And look at you. Have you even combed your hair today?" Bola felt the sting of the words, but said nothing. She kept her head down, cradling Faikimi. Mama Kunnel sighed loudly and began sweeping the floor. "You young women don't know how lucky you are," she muttered. "In my time, we didn't complain. We just did what needed to be done." Bola wanted to scream. She wanted to shout, "I'm not complaining. I'm drowning and no one can see it." But she stayed silent. The fear of being judged was stronger than the need to be heard. As Mama Kunnel swept the floor with loud, purposeful strokes, Bola felt her chest tighten. The noise of the broom against the hard floor seemed to echo in her head, growing louder and louder until it was all she could hear. Faikimi stirred in her arms, letting out a small cry. Bola instinctively held her closer, rocking her gently. Even the baby is crying now," Mama Kunnel said with a sigh. "What are you doing to this child? Babies don't cry for no reason." Bola bit her lips so hard it almost bled. She wanted to shout, "I am trying. I am doing everything I can." But instead, she nodded quietly, as though she agreed with the older woman's words. Inside, she felt something crack a little more. When Mama Kunnel finally left, the house felt too quiet. Bola sat on the floor, holding Faikimi, who had fallen back asleep. She stared at the tiny face, so peaceful and innocent, and wondered how someone so small could make her feel so much love and yet so much fear at the same time. That evening, Alakunal came home earlier than usual. He seemed surprised to see Bola sitting silently in the dark living room, the baby in her arms. "Bola," he said, switching on the light, "why are you sitting here like this? Didn't you eat?" Bola shook her head but didn't say anything. She didn't know how to tell him that even the thought of eating felt like too much effort. Alakunal frowned. "You need to take care of yourself," he said, his tone more puzzled than concerned. "What will happen to the children if you fall sick?" Bola felt the words like a slap. They weren't meant to hurt, but they did. She nodded again and forced herself to her feet. "I'll make your dinner," she said softly, heading to the kitchen. As she stirred the pot of soup, her hands trembling, she thought about how her life had turned into this endless routine of cooking, cleaning, and crying silently when no one was looking. The next day, as Bola walked through the village with Faikemi tied to her back, she overheard two women talking near the market. They were discussing a young mother who had recently left her baby with her parents and traveled to the city to find herself. "Can you imagine?" one of the women said, shaking her head. "What kind of mother leaves her child like that?" "I heard she said she needed a break," the other woman replied with a scoff. "A break from what?" "She's only looking for an excuse to be lazy." Bola felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She walked faster, their voices following her like a shadow. She couldn't help but wonder if that was how people would talk about her if they knew what she was going through. The shame wrapped itself around her like a heavy blanket, suffocating her. By the time she reached home, her hands were trembling. She untied Faikemi from her back and laid her gently in the cradle. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at her baby, tears pooling in her eyes. "Am I a bad mother?" she whispered to the silent room. The question lingered in the air, heavy and unanswered. The next few days passed in a blur. Bola moved through the house like a ghost, doing only what was absolutely necessary. She fed Faikemi when the baby cried and made sure Tenny had his meals, but beyond that, she barely spoke or interacted with anyone. Her mind felt like it was trapped in a fog, every thought was heavy, every movement an effort. One evening, as Bola sat by the window, she heard Tenny talking to their neighbor's daughter, Iridi, outside. "Why doesn't Mama play with us anymore?" Tenny asked in a small voice. Bola's heart broke. She pressed her hand against her chest, as if trying to keep the pieces together. Tenny was too young to understand what was happening, but his words made her feel even more like a failure. "I should be better," she thought. "I should be enough for them." But no matter how much she tried to push herself, she couldn't shake the crushing sadness that weighed her down. Each day felt heavier than the last, and even the simplest tasks became insurmountable. Tenny's laughter, which used to fill her heart with joy, now felt distant, as though it belonged to another life. Faikemi's cries, once a call to nurture, now cut through her like shards of glass. One particularly quiet afternoon, Bola found herself staring at the walls of her small home. The silence felt oppressive, and the weight of her thoughts became unbearable. She looked at Faikemi, lying in her cradle, her tiny fingers curling and uncurling in her sleep. A single tear rolled down Bola's cheek as a dark thought entered her mind. Maybe the world would be better without her struggles, without her failures. She wrapped Faikemi in a soft cloth, her hands trembling. She placed the baby on her back and walked out of the house, her steps slow and deliberate. The path to the riverside, one she had walked so many times before, seemed longer that day. The world around her felt surreal, sounds were muted, colors faded. When she reached the riverside, the setting sun bathed the water in hues of gold and red. Bola stood there for a long time, staring at the river as it flowed endlessly, indifferent to her pain. Faikemi stirred on her back, letting out a soft cry, but Bola didn't move. The words of her mother-in-law, the whispers of the market women, and her own feelings of inadequacy swirled in her mind. She felt trapped, hopeless, and utterly alone. In that moment of despair, Bola stepped into the water. The river embraced them both, quiet and cold. The next day, the village was in shock. Bola's absence was noticed quickly. She, who had been a pillar of strength for so many mothers, was now gone. When her body was found by the riverside, with Faikemi still wrapped tightly against her back, the entire community mourned. Tenny's wails echoed through the air as neighbors tried to console him, but no words could ease his pain. Alakunal was devastated. He had always thought Bola was strong, capable of handling anything life threw at her. The realization that she had been suffering in silence left him filled with guilt and regret. Mama Cunnel, too, was shaken. Her words, once spoken carelessly, now weighed heavily on her heart. "Why didn't I see it?" she whispered to herself over and over. Saad, who had tried to help, wept openly at the funeral. "If only I had done more," she cried. But the truth was, the signs were there, subtle, hidden beneath the surface, but ignored by a community that expected women like Bola to endure without complaint. Moral lesson. Bola's story became a lesson for the entire community. It taught them that strength does not mean silence and that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. Women, especially new mothers, carry immense physical and emotional burdens, and they cannot and should not be expected to bear them alone. From that day forward, the people of Ayetoro vowed to do better. Mothers were no longer left to fend for themselves after childbirth. Husbands, friends, and neighbors made it a point to check in, to offer help without judgment, and to listen without dismissing their struggles. Bola's absence left an indelible scar on the community, but her story became a call to action. It reminded everyone that compassion, understanding, and support could be the difference between life and loss. The river continued to flow, carrying with it the memory of a woman who gave so much to others, but was left alone in her time of need. May her story remind us all that no one should suffer in silence. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed our story. Please like, share, and subscribe. Bye for now.